tá no horário. Se o pessoal... Deixa eu conferir aqui.
Falta 6 minutos. 5 minutos, né?
Eu não sei porque, tipo, pra eu falar, ela não sei se
I've got the meeting I've been involved in.
É porque aí você não vai ter o
HIV course
você não vai
that's
ter o
run by
microfone.
an organization called Virology Education.
E esse microfone aqui
That's
pode
the
chegar mais perto.
20th anniversary year. They put on an annual course on HIV, clinical pharmacology, and I really with that. We're having that.
Então, você que termina, você fala, se vocês tiverem qualquer pergunta, só
That's
desculpa,
where the
depois,
first one.
quando você termina, se vocês tiverem qualquer
20
pergunta,
years later, we're going back.
if you have any
It's not the
questions.
only time we go back.
Yeah,
It's right on the
deixa
coast.
60 dias,
Yeah, the Netherlands.
deixa eu só confirmar aqui.
Especially this time of year, not summer, but I'm doing that editorial work.
Se bem que faz aquele esquema de repetir. Ou pelo menos a parte mais importante.
So, you know, little bits, a little bit.
But still,
Tá complicado.
Ai, meu Deus.
well, yeah, that's the whole thing. Often I feel like if I stop
Yeah.
Só um pedaço?
too hard to get chunks that
Right,
Yeah, checking
you're
here.
all ready
Yeah, we are all ready. I'm just wondering what are the 5 people.
and you tested the equipment and everything.
Yeah, I think so. There, the microphone is not, we won't hear from it because it's just for the recording. But yeah, everything
And
we
they
went.
already tested all your voices?
They did?
It is.
Yes. Actually, they just said we need to talk slopes.
Yeah.
All right.
I can hear that he heard, he does hear,
Okay.
it does work.
And so Jake, are we going to get the video after this?
Yeah, I think it's in a couple days, but
Hi, can I ask you a question? I just want to make sure that we will also have an archived version of this.
Yes, it's being recorded.
Okay.
Yes.
All right, thank you.
it's at 5.
Oh, I feel like I was doing, yeah, I always feel like I'm underprepared for something this small.
Yeah.
If it rains at all, you know, it's gonna be a number one in your scale, so won't be a heavy rain. I've lost faith in our weather forecasters here. I've never seen to. They may be able to tell you 15 minutes before it's actually, 48-hour prediction.
So when was that meeting that you met with Kathy?
It was last week, I'm trying to think which day of the week that was. It was last week.
We said
I don't have my calendar.
Monday was 6:30,
It was up at UCSF.
Tuesday 7:30.
I went to see Charlie. Carl was not there.
Just 'cause
He was there. Oh, yeah. It was on Monday because he was heading from San Francisco to Seattle since last week. So from home. So he lives on the West Coast. So he lives near 50. So he travels back and forth between Seattle and Philadelphia as needed basis.
But now will he,
No,
no, so
no.
he will be really running everything from.
Right. I don't. He certainly didn't indicate or suggest that he had any indications of moving to the West Coast, and I think it's probably one of the reasons he's ready to stay. Gates Foundation. Gates Foundation is such a huge amount
Escolhi um de vocês, não tá na memória.
Como não, amiga? Só lembra de tirar depois do papel.
Ah, não. Do you want to start on time or do you want to give some time if people want to are coming?
Well, I always start on time.
Okay.
I agree with that. Right.
Boa sorte pra gente. Can I start? Okay. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to welcome you all to join this discussion focused on the regulation of rare diseases therapies in Brazil. I need to say that this is a discussion of one of the case studies among several other ones that have been taking place in the past 3 weeks as part of the 2019 UCSF-Stanford CERSI Immersion program. And before we actually get into the talk, I would like to acknowledge some wonderful people that have been helping us out to make this case study possible today. So you'll see a list of names of people who really helped us out in this case study, and also some institutions that were crucial for the execution of this case study. So first of all, of course, we'd like to thank UCSF-Stanford CERSI program, the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, Anvisa, and 2 other Brazilian foundations, Fundação Lema and Fundação Estudar. Just giving a brief outline of what we are going to talk about today. So today's case discussion is divided in 2 different sessions. At the very first part, we'll talk about, we will introduce Brazil as a potential market for clinical trials, more focused on rare diseases. And the second part, we'll get more into details about the regulation of drug registration, also with a focus on rare diseases. I would like to take some time here to introduce our wonderful speakers that we have had the pleasure to join in the discussion for the past 3 weeks here. So for the first part, we'll have Cláudia Nora, who is a biologist and an expert in Brazilian clinical research regulatory affairs. Cláudia worked as a regulatory specialist at Albert Einstein Hospital in São Paulo, and she also holds a PhD degree in health science from the same institution. And then for the second part, focused more on the drug registration process, we have our visitors from Anvisa. Thank you very much for having you here around. It's been a very great time. So Alana Galeno holds a degree in pharmacy by University of Brasilia and she also performed 2 specialization courses, one in health surveillance by Pontifical Catholic University of Goiás, and another specialization course in health management by University of Brasilia. Alana is currently working as a health regulation expert in the Office of Quality Assessment of New and Generic Drug Products at Anvisa. Our other visitor from Anvisa is Gabriele Pereira. Gabriele holds a degree in pharmacy from Centro Universitário UNA with a specialization course in pharmaceutical care and clinical pharmacy at Centro Universitário Newton Paiva. Gabriele currently works as a health regulation specialist at Anvisa, and she works more specifically on evaluating post-approval chains for small molecule drugs. Just before I get more into the presentation, I just would like to let you know that we'll have a session for questions that will happen at the end of the presentation. Okay, I would like to welcome now Cláudia Nora to start the presentation.
Thanks, William, for the introduction. It's a pleasure to be here. Good morning, everyone. I will talk about Brazil as a potential market for clinical trials. It's important to mention that I am an independent contributor. The content of the following presentation is a summary of my professional experience and does not represent any of the institutions hereby mentioned. So I will focus in 3 topics: generic diversity, access, and time. Let's start with generic diversity. I like the way this map was drawn because it was drawn based on country populations. And you can see in proportion that Brazil is the largest country in Latin America and also the 5th most populous country in the world, with more than 200 million people. Few places in the world have undergone a miscegenation as intense as Brazil. The immigration of different people during centuries of colonization led to a heterogeneous miscegenation of the Brazilian population. Our Brazilian generic background is composed by European, African, and Brazilian Native Americans. And the genetic diversity is a large pool of potential volunteers. In the 1950s and 1960s, Brazil had a high number of consanguineous marriages. And this situation led a high prevalence of some disease. For example, mucopolysaccharidosis type 6 in a small city in the northeast of Brazil. There is a high prevalence of this disease in this city. There is only one drug available to treat this disease, and is already approved by Anvisa. But just few patients have access to this drug. But also, there are 3 new technologies in phase 1 and 2, but none of these studies are being conducted in Brazil. These clinical studies could be a hope for these patients. You have a high social impact for the country. We also have a high prevalence of spinocerebellar ataxia type 3 in south of Brazil. There is no treatment for this disease, just control the symptoms. And you had a high incidence of osteogenesis imperfecta. More than 2,000 people are affected. Also, there is no treatment for this disease, just control the symptoms. Brazil is a good option to companies that envision the development drugs for this disease, for example. And where you can find these patients? It's important to mention here that the healthcare is a constitutional right in Brazil. Currently, 75% of the population depend on the public healthcare system. With this in mind, in 2014, the Brazilian government created an ordinance 199 that establishes guidelines for people with rare disease, provides healthcare facilities, guarantees access to the diagnostic and therapeutic source available, and also qualifies healthcare professionals. Currently, there are 8 specialized centers to treat rare disease across the country, and there is 9 more awaiting for being accredited. This is a very attractive place to recruit patients. We also had a lot of patient associations. These places support patients and their families, participate in political discussions about rare disease. They are able to connect people with the same symptoms and provide information to the population, family, and professionals. Here, I mentioned some of the patient associations, but of course, there is a lot more across the country. And finally, let's talk about time. When a company finishes the non-clinical studies, and before you start the clinical studies, the study documentation must be submitted to the regulatory agency that in Brazil we call Anvisa, and the DDCM process is similar to the IND process in US. And also, the study documentation must be evaluated by the IRBs for ethical evaluation. Here, we have some particularity in Brazil, because the study documentation must be evaluated by the institutional IRB, that in Brazil is called CEP, and also for the national IRB, that in Brazil is called CONEP. CONEP times takes longer, and all the efforts is being done to reduce this time. It's important to mention that for rare disease, there is a new resolution 205 from 2017 that allow that the regulatory pathway and ethical evaluation can be conducted in parallel. This is able to save 4 months in this process. Some data provided by CONEP in beginning of 2018 shows that the average timelines for CONEP's first opinion letter was around 107 days. After the implementation of new resolutions, guidelines, and guidance, in 2017, this average was down to 27 days. I can say that in the last year, we have a competitive regulatory pathway in the country. I believe these 3 topics are the most desired characteristics of the clinical trials, and Brazil is already in place to be competitive in this market. Now that you had an overview about clinical trials in Brazil, I invite Alana from Anvisa to talk about the regulatory pathway. Thank you.
Oops. Sorry. Thank you, Claudia. Thank you, everyone, for attending. We are very pleased to be here and share the outcomes of these last 2 weeks' discussions regarding the new regulatory pathway for rare disease in Brazil. Please be aware that what we are about to present are the results of the discussions undertaken during the CERSI Immersion program, and it does not reflect the view of the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency, but only our own. Well, on this case study, the question raised was how to effectively guarantee expedited approval without compromising quality, safety, and efficacy. Well, to figure out the answer, we have to take into consideration the Brazilian landscape with an increasing number of applications submitted in our country, and also the recently published resolution for accelerated pathway of approval for rare diseases. And this is what we are going to talk today. As Claudia said, Brazil is the 5th largest country in the world with a population around 210 million inhabitants, comprising 26 states and the federal district. Last year, the annual revenue for the industrial pharmaceutical market was of more than $17 billion, and we intend to be the 5th biggest largest pharmaceutical market in 2022. Since today we are going to talk about health, it's important to emphasize that the Article 196 of the Constitution establishes that the health is a right of every citizen and a duty of the states. This statement enables free and universal access to the health care on the national public health system, called SUS. But what is rare disease? Generally speaking, is a life-threatening or chronically debilitating condition that affects a small number of people. The first discussions about this subject started mainly in 1983 with the United States government that issued the Orphan Drug Act, defining rare disease as one condition that affects less than 200,000 people in the country. 10 years later, the Japanese government also issued the Medicine Act, using a prevalence number on their country. They were followed by the European Union in 1999, and only in 2014, Brazil issued the Ministerial Order number 199. There's a little mistake here, it's on the year 2014. And this ordinance was really important because it created the national policy of integral care to people with rare disease, and also defined what is rare disease in our country. That is one condition that affects up to 65 people per 100,000 individuals. This measure, as was already said by Claudia, was a very important measure because it created a specific and multidisciplinary care for this population. According to the Ministry of Health, there are nowadays 6,000 to 8,000 distinct rare diseases in the world. 80% of them are caused by a genetic origin and 20% by infectious, viral, or degenerative cause. The same source also estimates that 13 million Brazilians live nowadays with some kind of illnesses, of these illnesses. 95% of them have no treatment or are treated with a palliative drug. 3% can be subjected to a surgical treatment, and only 2% have access to orphan drugs that are really able to interfere on the progression of the disease. Well, seeing all this landscape of rare disease, is important to say there are many other impacts regarding rare disease. We can talk about social impacts, economic impacts, and many others. But what we can do as a regulatory agency to give quick access for this population and also have an assessment regarding the regulatory science and always ensuring safety, quality, and effectiveness. Well, here I'm going to introduce Anvisa, that is the Brazilian Health Regulatory Agency. It was created 20 years ago as an autonomous entity linked to the Ministry of Health with administrative independence and financial autonomy. Its board of directors is composed by 5 directors, which are named by the president for a mandate of 3 years that can be renewed once. One of its competency is to issue regulations related to the health surveillance subjects. These regulations are called Resolution of the Board of Directors, RDC in Portuguese, and they must comply with the federal constitution and federal laws and decrees. Well, Anvisa's mission statement is to promote and protect the health of the population by intervening on the risks associated with manufacturing and use of products and services subjected to the health regulation. All this action is coordinated and integrated with SUS. This slide shows us the Anvisa's regulation scope. We can see we have many fields of action, as we can say, food, sanitizer, tobacco, medical devices, and many others. But today we are going to focus specifically on drug products. That assessment is done by the General Office of Medicines and Biological Products. Okay, the RDC 205 is the resolution that establishes the accelerated pathway of approval for rare disease. It was published in 2017 and came into force 60 days later. It defines the eligibility criteria for this special pathway and which are the requirements. First of all, this resolution establishes that the pre-submission meeting is mandatory for rare disease drug products. The company can also submit its dossier in the CTD format according to the ICH M4 guideline. And this resolution also provides a deadline for the issuance of GMP certification that is within 120 days. But the most important provision of this resolution is that it defines what is the expedited procedures for clinical trial authorizations and drug product registration. Today we are gonna talk about these topics step by step, and for that I invite Gabriela that's going to show us a little bit more about this.
Okay. Thank you very much, Alana. Good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. So, first of all, when we start talking about the special procedure for the registration of those rare disease drug products, we have to talk a little about about the development cycle. The development cycle of a drug for a rare disease goes through lots of steps. It goes through preclinical phases, clinical phases, the development phase, with the sending of the registration dossier, and finally the post-launch period. So we will start focusing on the drug clinical development dossier that we call in Brazil the DCM, as Claudia already said. This dossier is similar to the IND that's submitted to FDA, but it does have some particularities. The first one is that the DCM there is a submission of one DCM per experimental drug. So, for example, last year you did a clinical trial for this drug you are developing, and now, in this year now, you are going to do a second clinical trial. So you're going to submit, you won't submit a new DCM if you already submitted. You submit an addendum to the DCM. And second, the DCM is only applicable for the cases when the clinical trials are being conducted in Brazil. If they're conducted outside of the country, you don't need to submit to the DCM. So, your company wants to run a clinical trial in Brazil. What do you have to do? According to RDC 205, there are timelines and steps that have to be followed. The first one is you have to ask for the pre-submission request, and in up to 60 days, Anvisa will have the meeting with you, where we will discuss the documentation we already have, and after the meeting, you will do the submission of the DCM. After the submission of the DCM, Anvisa has 30 days to assess documentation and do a notification requirement if it's needed. After the notification requirement, the company has 30 more days to assess the notification requirement and provide the compliance information to Anvisa. And after the compliance information is received, Anvisa has 30 more days to assess the information on the compliance and make this final decision about the clinical trial. Next, we're going to after the development of the drug, with the submission of the registration dossier. The registration dossier is similar to either the BLA or the NDA for FDA, depending on the kind of drug you're submitting. Oopsie. And as it happens with the DCM, the dossier it's also, the steps are also provided on RDC 205. You have to have a pre-submission request with Anvisa. You ask for the meeting, and 60 days later, up to 60 days later, Anvisa will have the meeting with you. And after the meeting, you have 30 days to submit the documentation of the registration dossier. After the documentation is submitted, Anvisa has 60 days to do the first assessment of the documentation and do the notification requirements if they are needed. After the notification, the company has 30 days to provide the compliance information for Anvisa, and after the compliance, Anvisa has 45 days to assess the documentation and make its final decision. It takes up to 135 days. I forgot to mention, but the DCM, as Claudia says, 90 days. Oh, come on. Sorry. Wrong button. Yes, RDC 205 has some very important milestones for us. The first of all, regarding the clinical studies, it allows submitting studies only on phase 2, with phase 2 completed and phase 2 is still in progress. And in the cases where doing phase 3 is not feasible, you don't need to present phase 3. In the matters of quality control, usually when you register a drug in Anvisa, you have to do the quality tests of the drug, both on the manufacturer and in Brazil, But by RDC 205, if a drug is for a rare disease, you don't need to do the test in Brazil, as long as you do the test on the manufacturer and there is a qualification of the transportation chain system. And also regarding the submission of the stability studies, you can submit the studies only on ongoing. You don't need to submit the stability studies for the long-term stability complete. Even if so, you can submit even though you don't have all the results yet. Last but not least, there's the signing of the term of commitment between Anvisa and the requesting company. On this term, Anvisa and the company will have written the documentation that has to be sent after the product registration is done, and the deadline for sending that documentation for Anvisa. One of the, but probably the most important provision on RDC 205 for Brazil is the demand that the meeting request for the pre-submission must be held within 60 days after the first registration request in another regulation authority. So if you actually submit an NDA or a BLA to FDA, you have up to 60 days to submit the documentation as a registration dossier for Anvisa. This is very important for us because it assures that Brazil is on the first wave for both the registration and making those drugs available for our patients. Okay, so now we'll show some numbers since the law started, since the new regulation started. For clinical trials, we've had 17 clinical trials approved in Brazil in 2018. The time from conclusion varied between 7 and 164 days. So we do some calculations. The median time for approval is 40 days, and the average time, 58 days. We're actually using median here because the department that does the assessment of clinical trials in Anvisa uses median because of the big variation between the conclusion time. Sometimes some process might take just up to 7 days because they're simpler, but some others might take some time. So they feel that the median is a better way to evaluate that. Now for the registration dossiers, we have here the average time in days it took for them to be concluded. The gray times is the time that the process spends in queue before being picked up by Anvisa for analysis. Black time is the time that Anvisa spends assessing the actual documentation. And the blue time is the time the company spends answering our requests for extra information when this happens. In average, it takes the new rare diseases process has taken way less time than the new non-prioritized process, as you can see here. It's up to average 231 days, less than a year for the product to be available. And as you can see on the first graphic here, the pizza here, the prioritization requests is the result of the prioritization request that we do receive alongside with the documentation to evaluate whether the process is able to be on the fast track or not. We received 25 of those requests in 2018 since February when the new regulation came into force. Of those, 21 of them were approved, 1 was denied, and 3 are in other situations. They might be still in analysis on Anvisa, or the company might have withdrawn the request. And after the 21 approved requests, 7 of them became new drug products approved in 2018. Which are the products that we show on the other graphic on the other side, with that time between the submission and decision. The time varied between 122 days and 313 days for each one of them. And here we have a closer look up to those 7 drugs, new drugs that we talked about for rare diseases, and the conditions they treat. They range from cancer, liposomal disorders, cystic fibrosis, and among other indications. So we're going back now to the question that Alana proposed on the start. How do we guarantee the expedited approval without losing quality on our analysis? So the conclusions we reached were the following. First of all, we do need better and faster collaboration between Anvisa and other health regulatory agencies. Because most of the time, when we're talking about drugs submitted to a lot of countries at the same time, both Anvisa and both the other agencies are assessing actually the same documentation for the same product. So if we can exchange information, we could actually finish our assessments faster and make the drug available faster without losing the quality of our analysis. We also think that it's quite important to promote training and fostering the regulatory science research in Brazil in order to make good use of the people we already have in Anvisa. They are very competent, but we can always get better. And we also think that some of the projects headed by CERSI might be helpful for us in the part of the regulatory science research. And last but not least, we also think that both Anvisa and the Ministry of Health should leverage the innovative research produced in Brazil. We have already having some great results from some companies producing some great innovative things in Brazil, but we surely could use more. And so here are the links for the people who want to know about more about the administrative part of the process for submission of the DCM and both the DCM and the registration dossiers on the Anvisa site. Thank you very much for coming. We hope you enjoyed this presentation, and we are open now for any questions you might have. Muito obrigada. Hi.
I wanted to ask a question regarding the clinical trials. Are they required to be done in Brazil before a new registration?
Actually, no. We both work about quality here, but we asked about the Department of Efficacy and Safety. Oh, sorry. Yeah, Nadia, your name is Nadia, right? Nice to meet you, Nadia. She asked about whether you have to do the studies in Brazil when you want to submit on the drug. And the answer is not necessarily. We actually asked to the department that does the analysis of the assessment of the studies, and they answered the following. Usually they take a look on the composition of the patients, and if they think that it's too far from what you have in Brazil, like say the study make only in Asia, they will ask the company to assess whether the studies can be extended, when the results can be extended to the Brazilian population. And if the company, they evaluate the combination documentation in order to know if they if they need to ask to do the study here. But it's not usual to ask.
So, my name is Obi. You mentioned in the presentation that Anvisa wants to be on the first wave for innovative rare disease therapies within a 60-day period during simultaneous registration at other regulatory agencies. Does Resolution 205 address drugs for rare diseases that have been approved prior to the initiation of the resolution?
Okay, so Obi asked here if the resolution contains also is also valid for the drugs that were registered before February 2018, and the answer is yes. You can actually justify when you send the prioritization request for us, explain that you are on register now because it was developed before the resolution, and we will accept it. Hi.
So I was wondering, in the conclusions there, when we talk about fostering innovation, also in Brazil, and when I looked at the slide, when you had the 7 drugs, most of them, I believe, they were not developed in Brazil.
Yeah.
So do we have examples of like drugs that were developed in Brazil that may also be included in this resolution, or in the past, or?
Actually, about products that were developed in our country, I don't know for sure, because since the RDC 205 entered into force, I think we had only imported drugs, but before this resolution, we had the new vaccine for dengue. Really? But it was before the RDC resolution. Yes?
Hi, Nadia.
Yeah, I have another question. You mentioned that some countries already implemented policies for rare disease, and Brazil is among the most recent ones to do so. Do you believe that this is a worldwide phenomenon, and do you expect other Latin American countries to follow?
Okay, regarding the Latin American countries, if they have some policy of rare disease. I know that there are some countries, such Colombia and Peru, they already have these policies. I wouldn't say I don't know about other countries, but I would say that since this is a hot topic, if they don't have, they will have in the next years. Yes.
Do you want to comment on the value of these specialized centers for rare disease in terms of recruiting people in Brazil for studies of rare diseases?
Yeah, I guess.
Would you like to?
I guess this is better for Claudia.
I think it is. Yeah, sorry. These places, they don't focus in research in clinical trials right now. Usually sites outside of the specialized centers conduct clinical trials. But once they have the patients, so they have the experience to treat and diagnose these patients, they are a good source to interact with clinical sites and recruit patients with more efficacy. For example, here you can follow patients across the country, not in a specific place. In Brazil, once you have specialized centers to do this treatment, you will access to a high number of patients in one place. So I think this is very competitive.
Any examples of it so far? Yes. What's new?
I know there is a reference center in the south of Brazil. It's a public health center. And they have a very strong genetic research and genetic professionals there. And they conduct clinical trials in Brazil already. So they interact with the reference center and the clinical site too.
I have another question. In terms of, you also mentioned about like patient associations. I was just wondering, is there any way for like the patient associations or people from outside Anvisa to actually interact with the agency and know more about the regulations and things like that?
Sorry.
Me?
Yes.
Yeah, about
The interaction of the association and Anvisa.
Yeah, or anyone who wants to like know about the policies, or how would they approach Anvisa?
Directly during the assessment of the dossier, we don't do today, but before the issuance of this resolution, we had a period where we had a lot of discussions about what we were going to put on this resolution, and the associations had a specific period to say what they was wondering about this new legislation. And so they could exchange information with us from Anvisa.
Yeah, and we do know that associations also take part when there are the meetings with the board of directors, since they have some open meetings, at least once in a month. And if the subject is of their interest, the associations are known to appear there and maybe even ask questions to directors a few times, actually.
I would like to thank you all for being here. It's been a great pleasure to have our visitors from Anvisa here, and also counting on Claudia's expertise on clinical trials. And yeah, thank you very much. This presentation will be available online. So if you guys want to take a look at the links that were shown here, it will also be possible very soon, I believe. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.